was asked to talk about education and what it is and what it isn't. And I'd like to start by saying, at least from my perspective, what it isn't is something immediately useful. So I studied literature, Russian literature actually, which is probably the most, at least on the face of it, the most useless thing that you can study. I mean, really, after all, what could you possibly learn practically from studying Russian literature? So now I'm the president of a university, which is basically running a medium-sized business. So how on earth could studying literature, why didn't I study business or management or, I don't know, something else that would be obviously useful to running a university? And the answer, at least to me, actually, is that what I studied in many respects is more useful for running a university than some particular course of study in something like management or economics or business. And the question will be, well, why? Right? What could there be useful here? So what I would start with by saying, that if you read a book, you read a novel, let's say, right? A novel is a world. Each time someone writes a novel, they create their own world. That world is sometimes similar to the world that we live in. Sometimes it's not very similar to the world we live in. But essentially it's a model, right? It's a model of the world. And one of the biggest problems we have in our world and our experiences, we only have one life. I mean, some of you may believe that you were reincarnated before and you know, once upon a time you were a fish or something somewhere else. But for most of us, we live once, right? And because we live once, we only can experience what we can experience. And we have a tendency to think that whatever we have experienced is the only thing there is, right? Whatever we've seen, we believe that's how the world works, right? But if you read lots of novels, each one gives you the opportunity of going into a different world, right? And so each world that you see, once you've seen 2 worlds, or 3 worlds, or 4 worlds, then you stop believing that the world that you know is the only one there is, right? And each world you feel, when you enter the novel, you enter reading, at first you feel very uncomfortable, right? You enter some world, you start reading, I don't know, something like Братья Карамазовы, and it's not very comfortable there. I mean, not only does Dostoevsky drive you crazy, but the world is a very different world than your world, and you don't know how to orient yourself in that world. And then you start to read, and as you start reading, you begin to guess, oh, this might happen or that might happen, and you begin to feel more comfortable in that world. And then by the time the novel ends, you feel, well, not completely comfortable, but reasonably more comfortable. And then you read something completely different, some contemporary science fiction novel by a Chinese writer, let's say, and again, you are thrown into a completely different situation, a completely different way of being, and you have to orient yourself in that way of being, right? And there's no right answer. It's not like, oh, I have to figure out, you know, how to solve this particular problem, right? The issue with relatively specific kind of education is it teaches you how to solve a particular kind of problem. But a novel isn't a problem like that. A novel is a world you have to get used to and feel like you have some understanding of it, right? And so once you've done that 50 times or 100 times or 200 times or however many you've read, when you start getting into a new situation, you don't get confused, or you may get confused, but you don't get worried. You just go, okay, fine, new situation, fine, I know how to deal with new situations. Let's see how it works. Let's understand how the people in it behave. Let's understand what the parameters are, right? And that allows you to orient yourself relatively quickly in this new situation and feel again, not 100% comfortable, but like you have some understanding of what's going on. And for the purposes of managing something, a business, a university, whatever, that's incredibly useful. Now, it's true, it would be nice, perhaps, if I understood something about bookkeeping, finance, which I don't know anything about, or something like IT, which we spend 10% of our budget on. That might be good to know. But it turns out I can hire someone who knows that. Right? So as long as I know how to ask questions and orient myself and see the big picture, I don't have to know how to do that stuff. Right? I don't care about that stuff. So if someone comes and says, what should we do? Oh my God, we've lost like whatever, $1,000 on this. It's like, all right, fine. Is that a big thing or a little thing? I mean, I don't get worried about little things. So, we get, when I first came here, and the university was in the building on Staraya Plощad, maybe you know the old university AUCA building. So one of the first phone calls I got was from the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister said, you have to leave your building next week. I said, oh, really? How nice. Now, that's a bad thing, right? If we had to leave our building, that would not have been a good thing. We had no place to go. So that's the kind of thing you worry about, right? You worry about a huge earthquake that knocks your building down. You don't worry about whether you understand where $1,000 went. It's not a big deal. You'll figure it out. Right? Somebody else will figure it out, and then they'll come and tell you. Right? So again, from your various experiences, you learn what's important and what's not important. Right? One of the things that I see in Kyrgyzstan, and it has to do with the way education here works, I think, people have a very difficult time deciding what's important and what's not important. So you'll go someplace and people will say, well, we have some problems. Oh, good, okay, that's good. Let me hear about them. And then they'll give you a list of problems, which range from, I have cancer and tomorrow I'm going to die, to, I have this little pain in my fingernail over here, and that's bothering me. It's like, all right, let's worry about the big problem first, right? And then the little problem is not so important. We can worry about the little problem later. But for that person, all those problems are the same. And they throw them all at you at the same time, and they expect you to solve all of them at the same time. And it's like, no, that's not a good way. First, you have to orient yourself, right? Again, it's back to this, how do I make myself feel comfortable? First, you have to orient yourself, and then you can decide, okay, I have to deal with this now. I can deal with that later. I don't have to deal with that at all. And then you begin to work. Now, when you think about how do you design an educational system, right? So a university also provides not specific courses, but an overall educational system. So what I really worry about, again, is not what are we going to teach people in the advanced algebra course. I don't care what we teach people in the advanced algebra course. Somebody who knows advanced algebra will figure out how to teach them advanced algebra. I have to worry about, why are we teaching them advanced algebra at all? Right? Do they need to know advanced algebra? Is this something that's important for them, or is this something that's not so important? How do we understand what are our overall goals, right? What do we want from them? And now we get to the dirty secret of contemporary education, which is we have no idea. So those of us who are providing education now, we don't know what you're going to need 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, or 15 years from now. Certainly, as long as if we're talking about what you need in terms of knowledge, right? What they call here is znania, right? I have no idea what's going to be useful for you. I can be pretty sure that the vast majority of what you learn will be useless. I just don't know which of the things you learn will be useless. I know algebra will be useless. Algebra will be useless for 99.9% of you. Which is why you should never waste 15 seconds on it. But okay, that's a different problem. But I don't know what will be useful, because the world is changing incredibly fast, as you may have noticed. So when your parents, most of you are young, that's good. When your parents went to school, the Soviet Union, which is where all of them probably went to school, they were pretty sure that you could go to the university, if you went to the university, and they would teach you for 5 years to become an economist. And they would teach you everything you ever needed to know. right? For the rest of your life. So as long as you memorized every stupid thing they told you, they could pack you off to Kamchatka, and you could work as an economist, and you would know everything. You'd never have to do anything again except use the stuff you would learn. So the idea was like, it's a bear, right? In the summer, the bear eats as much as the bear can possibly eat and gets incredibly fat. And then all winter long, the bear sleeps and uses that fat, right? And then it doesn't have to eat all winter long. So that was the idea. You went to university, you got fat on knowledge, and then you would go off to Kamchatka someplace and you could live off that knowledge. Well now, again, whatever knowledge we give you is going to be obsolete within a week. Well, sometimes a year, sometimes 5 years, but certainly 5 years. So it means that knowledge, in terms of knowing stuff, as we would call it in English, becomes cheaper and cheaper. Right? It used to be that knowledge, we said knowledge is power. Right? That was still people say it. Knowledge is power. But knowledge isn't power if everybody can have knowledge. Right? If knowledge is just a bunch of facts, all you have to do is pull this thing out of your pocket, and this thing knows 1 million more facts or 1 billion more facts than you will ever know and you will ever care about. Right? So it can't be that what we're doing now is giving you knowledge of that kind. Right? If we do that, we will always lose. I will lose to your telephone. Right? And to compete with your telephone in terms of knowing stuff is really stupid. Right? I mean, I can say to you, what's the capital of the state of Kentucky? Right? I bet no one in this room except me, maybe someone else knows what the capital of the state of Kentucky is. But it doesn't matter because your telephone knows what the capital of the state of Kentucky is, and if you just ask it, right? So the problem is not knowing something. The problem is knowing why you want to ask the thing to elicit the response that you want, right? So it's a little complicated to say, well, what is our brain for, right? So if you look at human evolution and you say humans evolved over 150,000 years, let's say, over 149,900 of those years or so, information was a deficit. Right? There wasn't enough information. So the people who were the most valuable people were the people who knew the most stuff. Right? Why did people, in this country they have the concept of aksakal. Why is an aksakal someone you respect? You respect an aksakal because he's seen things over 80 years and he knows stuff. Right? He knows that when the sun sets this way, the weather is going to turn that way, and you better pull your sheep in from the fields, otherwise they're going to freeze to death. That's a really important thing to know. Right? I mean, if you don't know that, your sheep freeze to death and you starve to death. That's a bad thing. Right? So the aksakal is great because he knows stuff. Right? But now, we don't need that stuff. We have other ways of knowing that stuff. So just knowing stuff doesn't help you anymore. Right? And so teaching you stuff doesn't help anymore. What we have now is a new problem. Over the last 15 years, so it was 149,975 or 80 years of one thing, and then suddenly we have too much information. Right? Before we had too little information, and now we have too much. And we don't know what to do in the situation where we have too much information. Right? We keep saying, oh, we'll give you more information. But giving you more information doesn't help. You can't absorb the information. Right? The problem is, again, your telephone knows 100 billion things, but you can't know 100 billion things. So it doesn't help to give you more things to know, and it doesn't help for you to show up in front of me and say, well, I know all this stuff. I don't care if you know all this stuff. It doesn't matter if you know all this stuff. You still don't know as much as your telephone. So that's not going to do you any good. So now we have to deal with information overload. Right? And our education system has to teach you not how to learn stuff, but how to get rid of stuff. How to decide what's important, what's not important. Back to the same question of prioritizing. What's important? What do I really need to know? What don't I really need to know? What can I expect other things to do? How can I combine things in interesting ways? Right? How can I ask good questions rather than finding answers? Because as long as you ask a good question, again, ultimately your telephone will find the answer if you ask the question properly, or your computer program, or whatever other helpmate you have. So the goal is completely different now. the goal of education that we now have, and the challenge of education that we now have, is to teach you how to deal with too much stuff. Well, if we see how badly people are doing with too much food, right? So you know there's a huge problem in the world. Everybody's gotten too fat, and they all have diabetes and heart disease, and they're all, right? It's the same problem. For 149,950 years, there wasn't enough food, so people's bodies got used to taking in as much food as they could, whenever they could get it. Now there's too much food, but they keep taking it all in, and they get fat, and they get sick, and they die from obesity, right? So I don't want your brain to go the same way as your bodies are going, right? We have to figure out how to turn your brain into something that can avoid just random garbage that comes in the form of knowledge, facts, stuff, and we have to do something else. The problem, of course, is that most of our teachers and most of us are used to saying, oh, we know how to teach. I just get up and tell you things, right? And you learn them. I don't have to do that anymore, so what am I supposed to do? I look at my faculty kind of go, huh? I don't know. They already know what they need to know, so now what do I do with it? So, well, they don't know what to do with it. They know some stuff, but they don't know what to do with it. So your challenge, as it turns out, is figuring out what to do with what you know, right? And learning how to order it in various ways. And yes, universities and schools can help you do this, but the fact is there's always going to be new stuff. We can't keep giving you new stuff. So you need to get to the point where you can say, oh, I need something. Where do I go to get it, right? You're 27 years old, you finished university a few years ago, you're working somewhere, and suddenly you realize, you know, I really need to know something about that, right? Well, to get information about it, it's easy. You go to Coursera, you go to edX, you go to one of these other platforms, and you take an electronic course, and you learn something. But then you have to say, all right, now I learned this thing, now what am I going to do with it, right? So I now know how to program a computer using R. Okay, that's good. Now what do I want it to do, right? It's always going to come back to asking good questions. So in the end, that's really what you have to teach yourself how to do. Stop teaching yourself how to find answers and start teaching yourself how to ask questions. And if you ask good questions, suddenly you'll see people will respond to you. No one cares. If I walk up to you and say the capital of Kentucky is Frankfurt, yeah, so what? Right? If I ask you something that's more interesting than what is the capital of Kentucky, we can have a conversation. Right? If I ask you what is the capital of Kentucky, if you're smart, you'll just pull out your stupid phone and tell me, you know, it turns out to be Frankfurt, right? But so what? Right? But I need to ask you the kinds of questions that will elicit your brain to start working, and you need to ask me the kinds of questions that will elicit my brain to start working. And if we both do that, then we can both grow together. So if we go back to our world of novels, we're in a novel that's much less predictable than novels used to be. So in the 19th century, you know, at the beginning of a novel there was a problem, and at the end of the novel the main characters either died or they got married. Like that's the two things that could happen, right? Now we have no idea what's going on in this novel, and the characters are wandering around doing all sorts of strange things, and maybe they're speaking 4 or 5 languages to each other in the middle of this same novel, right? And you have to have, so I don't know if you've read novels of Murakami. Has anybody here read Murakami? So Murakami is a great novelist, but the main reason he's a great novelist is because precisely his novels work that way, right? They work like a world where you can't quite put it all together. It's like, what the hell is going on around here? I mean, if you read Tolstoy, it all comes together beautifully. Great, perfect. Like, that's not our world anymore. It's nice to know there was a world like that, and it's nice, maybe we wish there was a world like that again, and maybe we'd like to construct one in our little house. But in general, the world works more like a novel by Murakami than by Tolstoy. So those kinds of novels, that's the world you're in. Sorry, guys. And that's the world we're in too. So, I mean, in a lot of ways, it's more interesting. But interesting doesn't always mean comfortable. In fact, interesting usually means uncomfortable. So the more you can make yourself uncomfortable, the more you can put yourself in situations. This is why you need to travel. It's why you need to go places, see new people, right? You talk to the same people all the time. In the end, life is boring, right? There's a great line by Viktor Shklovsky, who was one of the great Russian formalist literary critics, who said, The purpose of literature is to make a stone stony, right? So we walk past the stone every day, it just sits there on the ground, it doesn't do anything, we don't notice it because it's just sitting there, right? Suddenly you see it in a different light, then suddenly it's interesting, right? It was just this piece of thing, now it's interesting. So your goal is in a world now where everything is interesting to figure out, okay, what's important here, what's not important, what can I ignore, what do I have to think about, and how do I make myself somewhat comfortable in a very uncomfortable world.